My name is Francesca, and I grew up in a family that most people would call a typical middle-class family where everyday life flowed smoothly in a predictable rhythm, like a pre-written scenario of everyday life with clearly defined roles and expectations, and where my mother, a neat, always collected woman, went to work at a local accounting firm every day, bringing home stacks of papers and figures that seemed easier to her than household conversations. And Dad was a tall, reserved man with an eternal shadow of fatigue under his eyes. He managed construction projects, often returning home with drawings under his arm and tired but confident words. "Today there is another delay at the site, but we will manage." And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. And then there was Chiara, my younger sister, blonde, haired, with bright eyes full of mischief and irrepressible curiosity, 3 years younger, but always the center of attention, whether it was our shared dining table or a family weekend, when her stories about school days interrupted even Dad's monologues about construction estimates. "Francesca, you need to set a better example for your sister." This phrase, uttered in my mother's voice with an intonation of reproach, but without real reproach, was repeated so often in our house that over time it turned into a background sound, like the sound of a dishwasher running or the creaking of floorboards on the second floor. I heard these words like a spell throughout my childhood and adolescence. When I forgot to make the bed, when I brought a 4 instead of a 5, when I just sat silently in the kitchen, not participating in the conversation, and it seemed as if my very existence was supposed to become a model of behavior, a coordinate system by which correctness was measured. Chiara's actions, even if she was drawing in a notebook instead of writing an essay, and I was poring over a calculus textbook, solving equations that gave ordinary teenagers headaches. I especially remember that evening. I was 16, Chiara was 13, and we were both sitting at the dining table, surrounded by the lamplight of the kitchen chandelier, where the heat from the incandescent lamps mixed with the smell of baked chicken and cinnamon, which my mother added to apple pie on weekends. I was once again trying to complete my math assignment, squinting at a notebook where the numbers were blurring like raindrops on a window pane, and Chiara was sitting across from me, buried in her notebook with drawings and pretending to be working on an English essay. "I don't want to write this essay, it's too difficult," she suddenly said with fatigue, in which, as it seemed to me, there was more pretense than real disappointment, and Mom immediately left the kitchen, wiping her hands on a colorful apron, and, approaching Chiara, said softly, "Oh, honey, it's okay, you're trying your best, maybe you can work on it tomorrow when you feel better." And there was so much warmth in that kindness, in that gentleness of her words, that for a moment I felt cold from realizing how differently she spoke to me. I couldn't help but remember how recently, when I was struggling with a similar task myself, my mother just dryly remarked, "Focus on your work, Francesca, you know you need to maintain these grades if you want to go to a good college." And although I nodded then, holding back tears, I felt like every time such a reaction stabbed into me like a needle into the dense fabric of hope that I did not stop weaving with since childhood. From a very young age, I dreamed of going to Princeton, which I read about in a magazine for schoolchildren when I was 10. Their computer science program seemed to me not just prestigious, but almost mystical, like something unattainable and sparkling in the darkness of everyday life. I worked like hell to keep up. I studied until nightfall, participated in all possible extracurricular activities related to technology, robotics, programming, and even founded my own club at school, where I taught other guys how to write code. But when I finally plucked up the courage to talk to my parents about Princeton in my 3rd year, their reaction was cold and peremptory. "Francesca, be realistic," Dad said at dinner, without looking up from his plate of rice and vegetables. "Private colleges are expensive, and we need to save up money for Chiara's education. You know, she might need some extra support. Your grades are good enough to get into any public school with a scholarship." Later that night, I was sitting in my room, surrounded by textbooks, with a pamphlet about Princeton in my hands, and my best friend Sarah, who came to check on me, found me at that very moment, sitting on the bed with my legs crossed and the shadow of the future in her eyes. "They rejected it, didn't they?" "What is it?" she asked, sitting down next to him. I nodded and whispered, "Yes. Apparently, I need to be realistic and save money for Chiara's college. But you know what? Let them want me to go to the state, I'll go to the state." But I'll make it work for me. I will prove that I can achieve my goal on my own terms. That night, sitting in the semi-darkness of my room, I made a silent vow to myself, not just to succeed despite the restrictions imposed on me by my family, but to succeed because of them, to absorb their doubts as fuel for my determination, and use every no as a stepping stone to my yes. I worked on the app between classes, on weekends, and even during the holidays, when other students went to the coast, had noisy parties, or just let themselves relax, while I stayed in the library or locked myself in my room, immersed in lines of code, carefully watching every character, debugging and improving the architecture of my application, which gradually turned from a simple idea into a living, functional tool. And the more time I spent on this work, the more I realized that it had become not just a project, but a real passion, almost an obsession, a meaning that fills my days and nights. After graduating from university, when most of my classmates went on internships or accepted job offers, I took a step that many would consider insane. I gave up stability and security, did not accept any of the offers I received, although some of them were very tempting, and decided to risk everything I had to present your application to various technology companies. Most, of course, ignored me, considering me to be just another enthusiast without serious support or a name behind them. Some responded with polite but unequivocal refusals, leaving behind only formal emails thanking me for my interest and wishing me luck. But then something happened that I did not expect. One of the leading technology corporations expressed interest, and I still remember how I found myself in that boardroom, where the air was saturated not with perfume, but with power and influence, and I, in my modest suit, bought at a sale, sat at a table opposite men and women in clothes that cost more than my entire student wardrobe, watching them test my app on their latest smartphone models, and when the CEO, an imposing man with icy eyes and impeccable diction, leaned forward and said, "This is an impressive job, very impressive," I realized that I had passed the first barrier. The negotiations that followed were complicated, full of legal nuances, meetings in different time zones and endless letters, but when the dust finally settled, I came out of this process with a check for $5 million. And I remember how that night, looking at the numbers on the screen of my bank account, I couldn't help but tremble in my hands, because not only could I not believe that all this was happening to me, but also because it became proof, not so much to others as to myself, that my work, my idea, my self-belief were real and worth something more. The first thing I did was buy myself a modest but cozy apartment in a nice neighborhood, where the windows overlooked the park and birds could be heard singing in the mornings. The second step was to start my own mobile app development company, naming it after the Latin word for breakthrough, and I invested everything else in savings and investments, deciding that I will never let circumstances dictate my dreams again. When I told my family about the deal, their reaction was curious. After listening to the amount, Mom had to sit down, as if her legs suddenly refused to support her body. Dad shook his head for a long time, either in disbelief or in an attempt to make sense of what was happening, and Kiara looked at me with an expression that I couldn't decipher, a mixture of admiration, envy and, perhaps, slight alienation. Everything changed almost immediately. I was no longer just an older sister who was expected. I became a woman whose financial situation put significant pressure on others, and 2 years later, when Kiara graduated from college and announced with shining eyes over Sunday dinner, "I'm getting married," Amerigo proposed, and I was genuinely happy for her, because she seemed really happy, and Amerigo himself made a good impression on me, polite, confident, with a warm look, and without hesitation, I offered her $20,000 for the wedding, believing that this was more than generous participation. But Mom, clearing her throat with that special intonation of hers, said, "You know, Francesca, weddings are very expensive these days," and Chiara, exchanging glances with her, added in a voice that sounded carefully honed melodiousness, "This is my only wedding. Don't you want your little sister to have her dream honeymoon too?" And, describing the incredible resort in the Maldives, she seemed to know in advance that my refusal would be perceived as a gesture of callousness. The pressure that I had been so used to since childhood had returned, but now it had a new connotation, not of responsibility, but of obligation. After long conversations and an internal struggle with guilt, I stumbled over my own thoughts and agreed to pay for the honeymoon in addition to the wedding gift. However, after the wedding, after their return, a pattern began to emerge that I initially tried to ignore, attributing to fatigue, to the strangeness of the new role. But with each passing week it became clearer and clearer, at first subtle, almost imperceptible remarks wrapped in jokes and light comments that did not seem to carry malice, but left after I feel bad about myself. I gave my mom a designer handbag for her birthday. She smiled, thanked me, but immediately added, "Oh, that's nice," even though I saw one in that boutique in the center. There was just a gorgeous model there, and although there was no obvious reproach in her voice, it suddenly became clear to me that now every one of my action is evaluated not by intent, but by the price tag. Dad, when I helped him with the car repairs, paying $1,000 for a new gearbox, grinned and said, "For a millionaire, Francesca, you are surprisingly restrained." I could have added it to the new tires. They said it with a slight grin, but I didn't hear humor in it, but a reproach, and every time I gave or helped, the feeling that I was being measured not by love, but by the zeros on the bill, hurt scratched from the inside. One Sunday afternoon, I was having coffee with my mom, enjoying a rare moment of privacy in her kitchen, when she, holding a cup with a delicate painting, casually mentioned, looking out the window, as if saying it to herself, "You know, your sister really loved that coffee maker you gave her for a housewarming party." And before I could react, she added, still in the same tone, although she once mentioned that she had seen a fully automatic coffee machine, it would be perfect for their morning routine. I put the cup back on the saucer, maybe a little too much, and without hiding my irritation, I said, "Mom, this coffee maker cost $500. She just shrugged her shoulders and waved it off. "Well, yes, but when you have as many as you have, what is a few hundred more, between sisters?" Speaking of Chiara, it should be noted that 3 months have passed since she and Amerigo returned from their honeymoon, and they were still living in my parents' house. And although at first I tried not to attach importance to this, over time it began to seem more and more strange, especially considering that Amerigo had a stable, well-paid job in finance, and Chiara got a job as a marketing coordinator for a large company, and her salary was clearly enough to start an adult, independent life. One day, while helping her sort through the shelves piled with bags and boxes in her old bedroom, the one she lived in high school, with posters on the walls and plush toys on the windowsill, I asked, trying to be tactful, "Why don't you guys look for your own place?" Chiara, without looking up, flopped down on the bed, among designer bags from boutiques and neatly folded clothes, and lazily replied, "Ugh, have you even seen the rental prices lately? This is ridiculous. We would just be throwing money away." I tried to argue that they have a stable income, but she interrupted, rolling her eyes. "Not everyone can just buy an apartment like you, Francesca. Some of us have to be practical." The irony of her words, uttered with a hint of reproach and veiled contempt, did not escape me, especially against the background of how she surrounded herself with luxury items that did not fit in with the image of a practical person. My mother, in turn, began to unobtrusively remind me more often about the difficulties in the housing market, as if telling me between the lines in which direction I should act. Almost every family dinner was accompanied by phrases like, "Did you see that the tiny house on that street was sold for $500,000? It's just a crime, that's what they're demanding now. Normal people can't afford anything else." She emphasized the word normal in particular, casting meaningful glances at me, as if my financial independence somehow took me beyond the normal human norm. During one of these evenings, after dessert was served, Mom sighed heavily, looked at Chiara and Amerigo and said, "You know, Francesca, when your father and I bought this house, everything was different. Young couples could really afford housing back then. And now." She waved her hand at the young couple sitting across from her. "These poor kids just don't have a chance in this market." I nodded silently, even though everything inside was shrinking, not from guilt, no, but from this constant, almost instinctive pressure that had accompanied me since childhood. A few days later, on another Sunday, I went into my parents' house using my spare key because I wanted to stop by for a minute to leave my mom's favorite cakes that I bought at the pastry shop that she loves. But when I entered the living room, I found an unexpected and strangely serious scene. Mom, Dad, Chiara, and Amerigo were huddled around the dining table, and papers were spread everywhere. Printouts, notebooks, documents. When they saw me, they suddenly began to hurriedly rearrange the sheets, as if I had intruded on something personal. "Oh, Francesca, we weren't expecting you today," Mom said in a too cheerful voice, and I caught a glimpse of the headlines on the papers, mortgage rates, property listings, and realized they were discussing buying a house. I just thought I'd stop by. "Everything is fine?" I asked, and Chiara hurried to answer, a note of tension in her voice. "Everything is fine, nothing important." I didn't insist, thinking that maybe Amerigo's parents decided to help, or they were finally able to save money for the initial payment. Anyway, I was sincerely glad that they seemed to have moved towards independence. However, just 2 weeks later, my mother called and, lowering her voice, said, "Francesca, we need to have an important family conversation. Can you come back tomorrow night?" I immediately remembered her recent complaints about the refrigerator, which she constantly repeated, about how it makes strange noises, how the ice maker stopped working, how the food, according to her, does not stay fresh long enough. All of this, of course, sounded like a reason for something more. When I arrived the next evening, the atmosphere from the very first step seemed strangely formal to me, as if I was not going to my home, but to some kind of business meeting or, worse, to a jury trial, where charges had already been filed and no defense was provided. Everyone was sitting in the living room, lined up neatly, almost theatrically, Mom and Dad on the couch, in their usual places, Chiara and Amerigo opposite, in armchairs that seemed specially turned out to frame the only empty space in the room, a place that, without any doubt, was meant for me. I sat down, feeling the air around me become a little thicker, denser, as before a thunderstorm, and immediately heard Chiara, looking directly at me, with an expression of apparent seriousness on her face, begin, "Francesca, we were having some family conversations." I nodded, expecting, of course, a request for a new refrigerator or another repair for something that suddenly stopped working again, but instead Chiara calmly continued, clearly having rehearsed her speech in advance. "Amerigo and I decided it was time for us to get our own house." I smiled sincerely and said, "It's great. I'm really happy for you. This is definitely the right decision." She exchanged glances with her parents, glances full of hidden tension, then took a deep breath and said, "Well, since you're so successful now and you have more money than you know what to do with." She paused, as if searching for words that would sound softer, but then that was it. She said it anyway, "We decided that you should buy us a house." Silence reigned in the room, thick and sticky like molasses, and I stared at it. At first I was sure that I had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" I gasped, trying to figure out if she'd actually said those words. But Chiara was already gaining momentum, confident, as if she had memorized the speech. "It makes sense. You have your own place, you bought it, right? Meanwhile, I'm still living with my mom and dad. It's unfair." I looked around the room hoping that someone would laugh and say that this was all a joke, a ridiculous prank, maybe even an attempt to test my sense of humor. But everyone's faces were absolutely serious. I slowly straightened up, struggling to find the words. "I don't understand. Why would I buy you a house? After all, you're my sister, yes, but..." And then Chiara, with a note of indignation in her voice, sharply replied, "You live in your beautiful apartment, you have millions in the bank, and I'm stuck here. I need my own place, and I'm not going to spend money on rent. You have the means to help me, so you have to." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, barely keeping the tremor out of my voice. "I'll tell you what I can do. If you need money for a down payment, I can provide an interest-free loan. We'll make it official through my lawyer." But before I could finish my sentence, Chiara jumped to her feet, her face flushed with rage, and she shouted, "Are you kidding? You're just jealous because I'm happily married and you're alone with your precious money." The accusation hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't let myself go astray. "I gave you $20,000 for the wedding, paid for a honeymoon in the Maldives. This money could cover my living expenses for a year," I said, already feeling something that I had been holding back for a long time boiling up inside me. "Oh, that's it." Chiara rolled her eyes. Poor Francesca, always counting pennies, despite her millions. "You're pathetic. I have earned every fragrance by myself." I stood motionless, suppressing the urge to scream, just looking at her. I built my company from scratch, without support, without investment, with only one laptop and an idea. I live within my means. I invest in my business. I have employees who depend on me, obligations that I cannot ignore. I have obligations to everyone except my family, apparently. Mom intervened, and her face froze in an expression that I remembered from childhood, a mask of disappointment, learned, painfully familiar. "I'm ashamed of you, Francesca. How can you be so stingy?" she said, and I laughed, incredulously, bitterly. "I've given Chiara more money in recent months than most people earn in a year," I replied, "and yet you live in a nice apartment, and your sister lives with her parents." Dad added without looking up, "What kind of sister are you?" I looked around the room, looking at the faces, so dear, so close. Mom, Dad, Chiara, Amerigo. These people who raised me, who I grew up with, now looked at me like a monster who refused to hand over hundreds of thousands of dollars simply because he was asked to. Chiara, smoothing the hem of her expensive designer dress, the one I gave her for her birthday, came closer and, calmer, but with a steely tinge in her voice, said, "This is how it will work. Either you buy us a house. It's a nice house. Not some cheap old house for beginners. Or you won't be a part of this family anymore. It's your choice." Mom and Dad nodded in agreement. Amerigo, the only one who could have said something conciliatory, sat in silence, with downcast eyes, clearly embarrassed, but not daring to object. I looked at each of them in turn, lingering with my gaze, as if trying to figure out exactly when this scrapping took place, at which point my family decided that love was measured in square meters and mortgage rates. Without saying another word, I picked up my purse, slowly got up from my chair, feeling every glance in the room pierce me like a sharp point, and headed for the door, as if I already knew deep down that this wasn't just a step away, it was a choice I was making between who I am, and who I'm expected to be. "Francesca." Mom shouted after me, her voice trembling with tension, "Don't you dare come out of that door." I froze, my fingers gripping the doorknob, as if the last thread was holding me on the border of two worlds, and I froze for a second, letting the silence absorb the tension, but I didn't turn around, because walking out of that door meant losing my family, at least as I knew it, but staying meant losing something much more valuable, your self-respect, the right to say no, the right to be yourself. I opened the door, and their angry, reproachful voices, an interweaving of disappointment, resentment and arrogance, accompanied me as I walked down the driveway, my head held high, but inside I felt something breaking, like in a cracking glass, imperceptibly, but irreversibly. The bombardment began almost as soon as I entered my apartment. The phone vibrated without interruption, notifications flashed one after another, messages from Mom, from Chiara, even one from Dad, a rarity in itself. As a rule, he preferred silent disapproval of actions rather than words. I didn't answer, I couldn't, not at night, not in the early morning, when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as dawn slowly turned the walls pink. It wasn't until the sky turned pale blue that I finally picked up my phone and opened one of the messages. "How dare you go out to your family like this?" Mom wrote, and the last part, "After everything we've done for you," hit me like a cold shower. I couldn't stand it. I called back. My voice was trembling, but not from fear, from the rage accumulated over the years. "Everything you've done for me?" "Like what exactly, Mom?" I didn't give her time to answer. "When I wanted to go to Princeton, you told me to be realistic. When I needed help with college, you said that I should be independent. I worked 3 part-time jobs to pay for my dorm and books. And you've been saving up for Chiara's education." In response, she screamed, trembling with resentment, "We raised you. They put food on the table, dressed you, fed you." I almost laughed. "It's called being a parent, Mom. This is the minimum." Everything else, my education, my success, my company, I built it myself. While you were thinking about how to help Kiara, I was working nights to create a path for myself. This weekend was the birthday of Aunt Eleanor, a woman with soft eyes and a patient voice who always found a warm word for me even in the most stressful times, and for a long time I hesitated whether to go or stay at home, but in the end I decided that I would not let the family drama steal my respect for the woman I sincerely appreciated. When I entered the restaurant, they were already there, Mom, Dad, Kiara, sitting at the far end of the long table, as if sitting on the throne of their own righteousness. I chose a seat next to Aunt Eleanor, and for a while everything was polite, almost tensely peaceful, until it was time for toasts. After my aunt's friends finished talking about her kindness and generosity, my mother stood up, holding a glass of wine in her hand. Her cheeks were flushed, and her voice was louder than usual. I would like to say something. The room fell silent, faces turned to her. About ungrateful children, she began, who forget where they came from. Horror froze on Aunt Eleanor's face, and I tensed, anticipating a blow. My daughter Francesca, Mom continued, is sitting here in her expensive clothes, with millions in the bank, while her own sister needs a home. She refuses to help her family. She became a selfish, greedy person. Aunt Eleanor stood up, trying to stop this performance. This is neither the time nor the place, Julia, but Mom was not going to stop. She owes us everything. And now she's not even helping her sister buy a decent house. My cousin Rachel, sitting next to me, whispered, "Oh my God, she's serious." Kiara jumped up, as if playing along with the scene. She forced me to sign a contract with a lawyer just to think about helping with the down payment. Her own sister. My chair scraped across the floor as I stood up. I gave you $20,000 for the wedding and paid for your honeymoon in the Maldives. My voice was clear and firm, but my heart was pounding in my chest like a drum. Now you're demanding a whole house from me. It's not a help, Kiara. This is a demand, this is blackmail. The guests at the table sat in stunned silence, forks froze in the air, someone's glass hung halfway to his mouth. We exposed decades of family problems in front of everyone. Aunt Eleanor, with calm determination, finally broke the silence. I know Francesca was more than generous. She helped me when Marco was being treated for diabetes, and Sarah with college fees. After her, others started talking. Cousin Mike reminded me how I helped with the repair of his car, and Sarah remembered how I paid for her emergency dental surgery. Mom and Kiara's faces turned red. That's how she helps everyone except her sister. Kiara screamed, in a desperate attempt to regain control of the conversation. I couldn't take it anymore, and suppressing the rage and bitterness that had gripped me, I went up to Aunt Eleanor, the only woman who remained by my side that evening, despite everything that was happening around her, and hugged her tightly, the way one hugs not just a relative, but someone who truly sees and she understands. And, leaning slightly towards her ear, she whispered, "I'm so sorry that everything turned out this way. Happy birthday." I didn't even wait for an answer. I knew I couldn't leave otherwise. And, feeling a lump rise in my throat, I left the restaurant, leaving behind whispers, piercing glances and arguing voices that sounded fainter and fainter behind my back, like a fading cacophony of ruined relationships. Later, I found out that after my departure, the evening actually ended. The atmosphere was too tense, and most of the guests quickly found respectful reasons to take their leave. Over the next few days, several relatives called me, those who were at that ill-fated dinner and unwittingly witnessed the public exposure of years of tension hidden behind the facade of a respectable family. They expressed their support, saying that they were shocked by my mother's behavior, that I had done the right thing, but still there was a dull, heavy echo of what had happened inside me, as if that evening I had finally lost not just my family, but the very idea of a family to return to. 2 days after the disaster, I received a notification on Facebook. My cousin Rachel, the same one who whispered in my ear in horror, had marked me in a comment under some publication. "Francesca, you need to see this," she wrote. I clicked on the link, and as soon as the page opened, it seemed to me that the ground was falling out from under my feet. It was my mother's post, not a personal message, not a private publication for friends, but an open, public statement written, as she claimed, with a heavy heart, "John and I officially disown our eldest daughter Francesca." Her selfishness and ingratitude showed us that she cares more about money than about her family. From that day on, we have only one daughter, our beloved Chiara. The post quickly received dozens of comments, mostly from family friends expressing either support or confusion. Someone tried to call for peace, someone blamed me, someone blamed my mother, but the bottom line was the same. It became public, a family tragedy, laid out for all to see, like laundry on a string. In the courtyard. I looked at the screen, at the words written by the woman who carried me out, fed me, took me by the hand to school, and felt a strange, almost icy calm. They did it. They finally turned their emotional manipulations into a performance, into a farce. Without hesitation, I opened the settings and blocked everyone: Mom, Dad, Chiara, even Amerigo, whose tacit agreement that night was as much a betrayal for me as my sister's words. Phone numbers, e-mail, social media, all this became part of the same wound, which I decided to cauterize so that it would not fester. Yes, it hurts. Yes, it burned. But it was necessary, like a surgical operation that could no longer be postponed. 2 months of blessed silence followed. I worked with renewed vigor, reassembling myself from the pieces, and found a good therapist with whom I slowly began to unravel the tangle of guilt, pain, and false commitments that had been woven into my life since childhood. I started to recover. And that's when I finally felt like I could breathe. I got a call from Aunt Eleanor. Her voice was concerned, soft but insistent. "Francesca, your mother is trying to contact you. She says it's urgent. She seems desperate." Before I could answer, the phone vibrated again, this time from an unknown number. For some reason, I already knew who it was. "Francesca," Mom's tearful voice whispered faintly, "please don't hang up." I was silent, waiting. She continued, hurriedly, as if words could save her from destruction. "We're going to lose the house. The loan we took out for Chiara's wedding, we used the house as collateral. We can't pay anymore. Your dad lost his job. We're barely making ends meet. Please, Francesca, we need help. You are our only hope." I barely held back a sob, not from pity, but from shock. "Am I your only hope?" I repeated, almost unable to believe what was happening. "I thought you only had one daughter now." She snapped, "If you'd just helped your sister." I interrupted her, no longer restraining either my voice or my feelings. "I'm a stranger to you now, Mom. You made that choice. Strangers can't demand money from me." Her voice became harsh, angry. "How dare you call your mother a stranger? Aren't you ashamed?" A bitter, almost hysterical laugh burst from my chest. "Shame? You publicly disowned your daughter because she didn't buy another daughter a house. A mother does not renounce a child because of money. The mother does not shame, does not manipulate, does not turn love into a contract. You've made your choice, now live with it." I hung up before she could say anything, and even though my hands were shaking and my heart was pounding, my resolve was rock solid. The truth came out later, during Sunday brunch with Aunt Eleanor, 3 months after that desperate call. "Your father is not unemployed," she said, slowly stirring her coffee. "He just switched to a part-time job. I wanted to better balance my work and personal life. And no, there is no bank threatening to take their house away from them either." I looked at her in amazement, and she sighed and added, "They made it up to make you pay again." I should have been angry, furious, but instead I felt a strange, almost luminous relief. The manipulation was so blatant, so transparent, that it finally put everything in its place. Through family rumors, dropped by one relative at dinner, then another in a casual conversation, I learned that Chiara and Amerigo had finally moved out of our parents' house and settled into a rented apartment, an event that, it would seem, should have happened a long time ago, if not for their habit of looking for easier ones. Covering up inaction by complaining about the injustice of the world. Apparently, now they have started saving for their own housing, exactly as they should have done from the very beginning, if they had a basic sense of responsibility. But despite this seemingly positive news, old grudges haven't gone away, and as my cousin Rachel told me over lunch at a cozy cafe overlooking the city's waterfront, they still talk about you at every family meeting. I sighed, feeling the familiar weariness slide over my skin. Kiara talks all the time about her selfish millionaire sister, Rachel continued with a grin, who doesn't want to help her own family. I raised an eyebrow. And how do others react to this? I asked, preparing to hear another list of critical remarks about me. But Rachel suddenly laughed. Most people now try not to invite them at all. No one wants to spend the holidays listening to endless complaints about your cruelty and betrayal. People are tired of it. It was at this moment, sitting across from my cousin, staring at the sunlight in her glass of lemonade and feeling something inside me align, as if a piece of a puzzle had finally fallen into place, that I suddenly realized I had spent too many years desperately trying to prove myself to people who call themselves mine. I believe that I am worthy of their approval, that I am a good daughter, a good sister, reliable, strong, the one you can always count on. But all this time, I was nothing more than a personal ATM, a convenient resource whose love was accepted only in the wrapper of money transfers and paid checks. Their love came with conditions, with price tags and endless demands, which slowly but surely burned out in me the belief that true intimacy is possible. That evening, when I returned home, I made a decision. I made a call that changed the direction of my life to Sophie, my former college roommate who became a personal stylist. I need a change, I said, leaving no room for doubt. Complete transformation. And she understood. The next few months flew by like a whirlwind. Sophie helped me completely update my wardrobe, replacing my practical, functional clothes with those that emphasize my strength, my individuality, and my inner freedom. I started visiting a cosmetologist, who developed a care for me that made my face shine not only externally, but also reflect internal changes. I got a new haircut, shorter, sharper, reflecting the determination I finally found in myself. But the changes weren't limited to the outside. I started saying yes to things I'd always said no to, not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid it would be wrong, inappropriate, and unwise. When my friend Jessica suggested a spontaneous weekend trip to Paris, I went. When my friend Mark from the startup community invited me to join his climbing group, I took a chance and went. I expanded my social circle. I joined a book club, started participating in a women's entrepreneurial network, and became a mentor for young programmers, especially girls, in whom I saw myself, the old, scared, but full of dreams. My company grew, taking on a new shape, and people began to gather around me who appreciated me not for my bank account, but for my ideas, my energy, and my human warmth. A year after that ill-fated Facebook post by my mother, I received an invitation to my cousin Marco's wedding. I knew that my parents and Kiara would be there, but for the first time in all this time, the very thought of it did not cause me any horror or pain, only a calm acceptance, as if I finally realized that the presence of other people does not determine my dignity. A week before the wedding, I was flipping through old photos, and one of them, from my graduation from college, made me hold my gaze. I barely recognized that girl, in an oversized jacket, with an anxious smile and eyes full of hope. She was so desperate for approval, so afraid to stand up for herself, so eager to be good, so that she would finally be recognized. I wondered how she would feel knowing who she would become, a woman, successful, strong, free, who was no longer afraid to say no, even if it meant losing someone forever. I framed that photo and put it on the table, not as a reminder of what I had lost, but as a symbol of what I had gained, my strength, my freedom, my true self. Sometimes leaving is not the end, it's the beginning. Sometimes the family you were born into is not the family you're meant to keep. And sometimes the greatest act of self-love is simply to say no to those who treat your boundaries as offers and your love as a resource. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.